They called him the Apostle of Liberty. Yet behind his mansion's locked door, freedom slept in chains. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a man who promised equality for all built an empire on human ownership, fathered his own slaves, and buried the truth so deep that it took DNA to exhume it. The night air over Monticello hung thick with the hum of summer insects, their rhythm blending with the faint creak of wooden floors and the distant crackle of a lantern's flame. Inside the great house on the hill, a man who had written the most powerful words about freedom sat alone at his desk. Thomas Jefferson's quill scratched across parchment, the ink glistening in the candlelight as he shaped sentences that would one day be carved in marble. He was the philosopher of liberty, the architect of independence, the voice that declared all men are created equal. But the words on his page could not quiet the whispers that drifted through his own estate, whispers about the people who lived in his shadow, and the children who bore his face. Below the grand staircase, far from the rooms where statesmen dined and foreign envoys toasted, the night sounded different. There, in the dim quarters of the enslaved, a woman stirred. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was 20-something, soft-spoken, and belonged to the man upstairs, though not in the way history first dared to write. In the quiet of the Monticello night, she soothed a restless child, humming a low tune her mother once sang in the fields. That child, with hazel eyes and auburn hair, was rumored to be Jefferson's own. The servants knew. The overseers pretended not to. And the walls, soaked with decades of silence, kept their secrets well. It began, they say, years earlier, long before the nation had a president, when Jefferson was still in France as a diplomat. Sally had gone with his daughter, a young girl needing a caretaker. She was barely 15, and for the first time in her life, she walked on soil where slavery was illegal. In Paris, she saw black men and women living as free citizens, walking openly through the market streets, speaking with dignity, their backs unbranded by ownership. She must have felt it, the first taste of freedom, sharp and intoxicating, and yet she returned to Virginia, returned to the man who owned her. Some said he promised her things no slave could dream of: better rooms, education for her children, and most of all, eventual freedom. Some said it was not a promise at all, but an arrangement written in silence, sealed by power. Whatever it was, when she stepped back onto Monticello's red earth, she was already carrying his child. From that day forward, a strange duality defined her life, both invisible and central, enslaved and indispensable, kept hidden yet always near. In Jefferson's personal records, the pattern emerges quietly, coded in the language of property. Each birth marked with initials, each life calculated like an entry in an account book. He noted the day his horses were shoed, the weather, the arrival of wine shipments from Europe, and alongside them, the children born in bondage beneath his roof. Historians later found that the children born to Sally Hemings were treated differently. They were trained in trades, educated, and eventually freed, unlike nearly everyone else on the plantation. To some it was evidence of compassion. To others, proof of guilt. Jefferson never wrote Sally's name in his letters. Never once did he acknowledge the children as his own. But silence can be louder than denial. Guests at Monticello whispered about the boys with his eyes, the girls with his smile. Even his political rivals in Washington took note, though the newspapers would not dare print it, not yet. But among the enslaved community, the truth was an open secret. They saw the way he looked at her. They saw who came and went from the upper floors at night. They knew what history tried to forget, and still, by morning, Jefferson would walk his gardens with the calm of a philosopher. He would speak of equality, of the moral conscience of a nation, of natural rights bestowed by God. His hands, stained with ink, carried the weight of human ideals, and yet, those same hands had written the names of people he owned. To visitors, Monticello appeared a temple of reason. But to those who lived beneath its roof, it was a house divided by bloodlines and lies. Years later, when workers began restoring the estate, they found beneath the plaster and paint an echo of that contradiction, the faint outline of a hidden door, a small room beside Jefferson's own. It was likely where Sally Hemings slept. The room was windowless, silent, and close enough that she could hear him stir in the night. The walls carried no words, no trace of their conversations, no record of what passed between them. But in that still space, the myth of the perfect founder began to unravel. For 2 centuries, the story of Monticello remained polished, its portraits glowing with virtue. Yet beneath the varnish, something darker had always lingered. A secret written not in letters or ledgers, but in the blood of generations. The same man who shaped a nation's definition of freedom had shaped his own legacy around silence. And silence, as it turns out, can last longer than truth. By the summer of 1802, the air in Virginia carried more than the scent of tobacco and rain. It carried rumors, whispers that rolled down the hills of Monticello like thunder still too far to see, but too near to ignore. Jefferson was now President of the United States, a living symbol of reason and virtue. His portraits hung in parlors and offices from Boston to Charleston, his words recited like scripture. But power has a way of amplifying echoes, and the whispers from Monticello were growing louder. People spoke of the woman who lived there, of the children who bore a striking resemblance to the man in the Capitol. It was a journalist named James Thompson Callender who finally decided to turn rumor into scandal. Once an ally of Jefferson, the very man who had helped publish Callender's own writings against the Federalists, he now nursed a wound of betrayal. Jefferson, it was said, had refused him a government post. The insult burned, and Callender, with ink as sharp as a blade, set out to destroy the man who had turned his back. In September 1802, the Richmond Recorder published what would become one of the earliest political exposés in American history. The headline was unassuming, but the words beneath it were venomous. Callender accused the president of keeping as his concubine one of his own slaves. The woman's name, he said, was Sally, and she had borne him several children who looked exactly like him. The nation read, horrified and enthralled. In taverns and drawing rooms, men lowered their voices when the subject arose. Jefferson's defenders called the story slander, a fabrication by a bitter enemy. But others weren't so sure. After all, those who had visited Monticello whispered the same thing long before the article appeared. They had seen the children, fair-skinned, light-haired, moving between the kitchen and the main house with an ease uncommon for slaves. Some even noted how Jefferson never sold them, how he granted them unusual privileges. The scandal rippled through Washington like a fever. Federalists rejoiced. Their most eloquent adversary was suddenly vulnerable. Pamphlets spread, letters were reprinted, and taverns filled with laughter at Jefferson's expense. Yet in the heart of Monticello, no one spoke aloud. The slaves continued their work. The field still needed tending, and the master still needed his peace. Sally Hemings remained silent. She always had. Jefferson himself never issued a public denial. To those who pressed him privately, he replied only with measured calm, a lawyer's restraint masking something deeper. Perhaps he knew that to dignify the charge with an answer would give it life. Perhaps silence was the only defense left to a man trapped by his own ideals. His allies rushed to his aid. One wrote that the president was a man of too much virtue for such depravity. Another dismissed the tale as an indecent fiction unworthy of notice. Yet for all their bluster, not one could explain away the oddities at Monticello. The freedom granted to certain enslaved children, the travel records that matched the pregnancies, the locked doors and separate chambers. Outside the mansion, ordinary citizens debated the matter in hushed tones. Some were outraged that their president, the champion of liberty, might share his bed with a woman he owned. Others said it was no scandal at all, only hypocrisy made visible. The idea of interracial intimacy horrified a young nation still defining its boundaries of race and power. But for the enslaved people of Monticello, it was not horror that lingered, it was familiarity. They had seen such things before. They had watched masters claim the bodies of women who could never say no. Jefferson's difference was not in his actions, but in the silence that followed them. Callender's words haunted him soon after. Within a year, he drowned under mysterious circumstances in the James River, found face down near the water's edge, his pockets full of coins. The newspapers that once echoed his scandal now printed his death as a curiosity. Jefferson's name survived. His legacy, though bruised, endured the assault. But for the first time, a crack appeared in the marble of his myth. Visitors to Monticello after the scandal described a new tension in the air. Jefferson remained polite, composed, ever the gentleman. But those who observed him closely said his eyes lingered longer on the horizon. His letters grew shorter, and his solitude deepened. The children, still too young to understand the storm surrounding them, continued to play near the gardens. The resemblance that had once been a quiet curiosity was now an open wound. One neighbor, years later, confessed to a visitor. You could tell which were his. They had his hair, his walk, even his laugh. The world outside could debate as it pleased, but inside Monticello there was no debate, only the uneasy coexistence of shame and affection. The President of the United States had become both father and master, author of freedom and keeper of bondage. The contradiction wasn't new to America. It was America. The newspaper scandal of 1802 didn't destroy Thomas Jefferson. It couldn't, but it changed the way his story would be told forever. What had once been a rumor became part of the record, a shadow that no monument or marble statue could erase. The nation moved on, but the question lingered in every generation that followed. How could the man who wrote of liberty live with such a secret beneath his own roof? When Jefferson died in 1826, his estate was left in meticulous order, at least on paper. His journals, ledgers, and account books were stacked with the same precision he had once given to his architecture. Every entry was neat, every figure balanced. It was a portrait of control, a man who documented the world as if it could be mastered through ink and numbers. But buried in the neatness were marks that didn't fit, strange initials, dates that seemed personal, lines that hinted at a private truth too deliberate to be accidental. The discovery would come generations later, when historians began to study the Monticello farm books not as financial records, but as windows into the soul of a man who believed everything could be categorized, even people. Between the entries for sheep and wheat harvests appeared the names of the enslaved. Ned, valued at $400. Betty, spinning 8 pounds per day. It was a cold arithmetic of human lives. But among those rows, the handwriting changed slightly, softer, slower, whenever Jefferson recorded the births of children. The pattern soon revealed itself. Certain initials, always the same, appeared beside the records of Sally Hemings' children. There was BH, HH, MH, each followed by notations of apprenticeship or emancipation. The ages at which they were freed were identical, 21. No other enslaved child at Monticello received such treatment. To anyone looking closely, it wasn't bookkeeping. It was confession disguised as order. Jefferson's defenders would later insist that the pattern meant nothing, that the president was simply generous to one favored family. But the arithmetic of compassion rarely fits so neatly into columns. Each entry was dated with precision, and those dates matched perfectly with Jefferson's presence at Monticello. Whenever he was away for months or years, there were no births to record. Whenever he returned, the pattern resumed. It was as if the truth of his private life had been preserved not in gossip or scandal, but in the language of administration, hidden in plain sight, beneath the weight of ink and routine. And Jefferson, the master of language, must have known what those marks would one day mean. Perhaps he trusted that the quiet dignity of his handwriting would disguise the enormity of what it contained. Perhaps he believed no one would ever dare to read it this way. The ledgers also revealed something else. Each time one of Sally's children reached adulthood, Jefferson noted their freedom not as a gift, but as a transaction, a calculation that turned love, guilt, or duty into economic exchange. Freedom was recorded like a debt paid. He didn't write their names in letters to Congress or mention them in his will. Their lives and their connection to him remained confined to the silent logic of his records. A historian who examined those pages years later described it best. He didn't confess with words. He confessed with structure. Every pattern, every interval, every release at 21 spoke louder than denial ever could. It was the architecture of secrecy, built by a man who designed his home with hidden staircases and private passages, now mirrored in the design of his papers. Visitors who came to Monticello in those years saw none of this. They saw the grand library, the telescopes pointed at the stars, the inventions of a mind obsessed with order and reason. But beneath the surface of that order lay the evidence of a man divided, the philosopher who wrote of equality while measuring out human bondage in columns of figures. Some scholars, decades later, tried to interpret those notations differently. They said Jefferson was merely recording manumissions, that his compassion for the Hemings family reflected a humane master, not a guilty one. But others saw through the arithmetic. The ledgers, when read alongside letters and travel logs, formed a map of intimacy too precise to ignore. Each date of conception corresponded with his stays at Monticello. Each child's emancipation coincided with the age Sally had been promised in Paris years earlier. It was not coincidence. It was fulfillment. And so, the ledgers became a kind of ghostly testimony, a record that spoke after its author could not. There were no love letters, no diaries of passion or remorse, only numbers. And yet, in their repetition, they told a story more damning than words ever could. The children who bore his likeness walked free because their existence could not remain invisible forever. The man who calculated freedom as if it were a figure to be balanced left behind the evidence of his contradiction written in his own hand. When those pages are turned today, the ink has faded to a soft brown, but the marks still catch the light. The initials, the dates, the small symbols beside the word freed, all remain. They are fragments of a truth Jefferson tried to quantify, the quiet evidence of a secret life ordered into columns, waiting for someone someday to read between the lines. The story of Monticello's secret didn't begin in Virginia. It began across the ocean, in the glittering salons of Paris where Thomas Jefferson served as the American minister to France. The year was 1787, and the air of revolution was thick. Not yet American, but French. Ideas of liberty and equality filled the streets like perfume and smoke. In the center of it all stood Jefferson, widowed, dignified, and surrounded by philosophers and artists who worshipped the language of freedom. Yet in his own household, he brought with him the institution that contradicted everything France represented. Among his servants was a young enslaved girl named Sally Hemings, barely 15 years old. Sally had come to Paris as the maid to Jefferson's daughter, Martha. For the first time in her life, she walked streets where slavery was outlawed. The law of France declared that anyone setting foot on its soil was free. She could have left at any moment, vanished into the alleys, found refuge among the growing abolitionist circles that met in candlelit rooms near the Seine. Freedom was not an idea here. It was reality, and yet she stayed. Jefferson, then in his 40s, had lost his wife not long before. In letters from that period, his tone shifts from the grand declarations of liberty to something quieter, more reflective. He wrote of loneliness, of the emptiness of returning each night to a silent house. Historians would later piece together what might have happened during those Parisian years, how affection blurred into dependency, and dependency into something darker. Sally Hemings was not free, not truly. Even in France, her freedom existed only in theory, for she knew that the moment she returned to Virginia, she would again be property. There were whispers among Jefferson's staff, hints of an arrangement struck between them, a promise, unspoken yet binding, that if Sally returned to Monticello, her future children would one day be freed. It was the kind of bargain that only the enslaved were ever forced to make, trading the possibility of their own liberty for the fragile hope of freedom for their children. And so, she agreed. The journey back to America was long, the ocean restless beneath the ship's deck. By then, she was already carrying his child. Some accounts suggest she refused to return at first, that Jefferson had to persuade her, even plead with her. But whatever passed between them in those quiet Parisian rooms was buried by history. Only the outcome remained. She came home with him, and with her began the generation of children who would carry both his blood and his silence. Back in Virginia, the rhythms of Monticello resumed, slaves at work in the fields, the overseer's voice echoing across the hills, the master returning to his studies. Yet something had shifted. Sally was no longer just another name on the inventory. Her room, positioned near his, became both sanctuary and cage. The other enslaved women noticed the subtle privileges she was given. Finer fabric for her dresses, lighter work, occasional gifts. But they also noticed the distance, the way she avoided their gaze, the weight she carried that no one dared name. Jefferson's daughters, raised in Paris alongside Sally, would later walk the same halls at Monticello, aware but silent. It was a silence bred not from ignorance, but from the cruel etiquette of the time, the unspoken rule that the private lives of powerful men must remain untouched. The great man's contradiction was invisible by design. Years later, when visitors came to Monticello, they saw the grand architecture and the cultivated gardens, but never saw the quiet girl from Paris who lived just beyond the president's chamber. They would marvel at his intellect, his invention, his vision of freedom. Few asked how such a vision could coexist with the presence of enslaved people who moved through his home like shadows. The letters Jefferson wrote from Paris reveal a man seduced by the ideal of liberty but incapable of applying it where it mattered most. He admired the philosophy of Rousseau, the poetry of Voltaire, the courage of those who sought to end tyranny. Yet, in the small hours of the night, the same man kept company with a woman who could not refuse him. It was a contradiction too profound to name, a collision between enlightenment and ownership, between love and possession. Historians who retraced Sally's journey across the Atlantic often paused at one detail. She was pregnant when she returned to Virginia, and the child did not survive long after birth. Her second child, also Jefferson's, was born not long after. Each new life tied her fate more tightly to his, until her identity was inseparable from the man who claimed to fight for human dignity. That Paris chapter would become the foundation of all that followed. The reason Jefferson's ledgers bore those coded initials, the reason his silence deepened when accused, the reason generations of historians debated what he could never admit. It was in Paris, under the banner of liberty, that the contradiction of Thomas Jefferson's life took root, not as rumor or scandal, but as a private truth that would haunt his legacy for centuries. By the early 1800s, Monticello had become more than a home. It was a monument to contradiction. Visitors described it as both a palace and a plantation, a symbol of enlightenment perched on a mountain of bondage. Jefferson's ideals were carved into the marble of America's founding documents. Yet the evidence of his private hypocrisy walked quietly through his gardens, carried his blood, and served his meals. The enslaved children born at Monticello were lighter in complexion, their features echoing those of their master. Locals began to whisper. The name Hemmings carried weight, not just among the enslaved, but in the parlors of Virginia's gentry. Among Jefferson's peers, such whispers were common. Many of the Southern elite had children by enslaved women, but Jefferson's case was different. He was not merely a planter. He was a philosopher, a president, the voice of liberty itself. To acknowledge his mixed-race children would have been to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of the American promise. And so he built a silence as deliberate and enduring as the dome above his estate. Sally Hemings lived in that silence. Her quarters, positioned close to Jefferson's, were both intimate and invisible. She rarely appeared before guests. There were no letters in her handwriting, no public records of her words, no testimony of what she felt for the man who owned her. But her children told their story through their survival. Of the 6 she bore, 4 lived to adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Each carried Jefferson's unmistakable resemblance, a living contradiction to the purity of his public image. The white world of Virginia refused to speak of it openly. But the enslaved community at Monticello needed no proof. They saw the privileges, the lighter workloads, the quiet protection Jefferson gave to the Hemings family. Sally's brothers were skilled artisans and craftsmen, favored among the enslaved. Jefferson allowed some of them to earn small wages, an unheard-of liberty for slaves of the era. These acts did not stem from compassion alone. They were the careful maintenance of a secret that could not afford exposure. For the Hemings children, the contradictions defined their existence. They were educated, trained in trades, and treated differently from the others, yet they could never claim legitimacy. In the 1820 census, when Jefferson's name stood among the nation's elite, those children did not exist, not as citizens, not as his blood. They existed only in the margins, where America kept the truths it could not face. It is said that as the children grew, Jefferson's resolve to protect them hardened into quiet determination. He arranged their futures as carefully as he had drafted his political doctrines. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to run away, a fiction that concealed their manumission. Madison and Eston were freed in his will. The others, born of different parents, remained enslaved. Jefferson's legacy of liberty stopped at the threshold of his bloodline. Meanwhile, the public image of the statesman shone brighter than ever. Portraits of Jefferson hung in state halls. His words were studied in schools. His writings hailed as sacred text. Newspapers called him the philosopher president, the last living link to the age of the Revolution. When visitors came to Monticello, he guided them proudly through his inventions, the revolving bookstand, the clock that tracked the sun's passage, but never to the quarters where Sally Hemings lived. He could show them the world as he wished it to be, but not the truth that lingered behind closed doors. By the time Jefferson reached his final years, the plantation was burdened with debt. His fine wines, books, and curiosities were auctioned off piece by piece. The enslaved people who had built his life's work were listed among the assets to be sold. Only the Hemings family escaped that fate, spared by Jefferson's unspoken acknowledgement of their connection. For Sally, the end of his life meant the first real taste of freedom. After his death, she was allowed to live as a free woman in Charlottesville. A quiet ending to a life that had been anything but. The world beyond Monticello moved forward, yet the shadow of its contradictions remained. Travelers who visited the estate after Jefferson's death described an eerie stillness, as if the place itself carried his secret. The walls that once echoed with political debate and philosophical reflection now held only silence. The Hemings family began to drift outward, some passing as white, others living openly as people of color. They carried within them both halves of a nation still divided between its ideals and its sins. When Jefferson's grandchildren inherited the estate, they spoke of their grandfather's genius, his love of liberty, his devotion to reason. None mentioned the woman who had shared his life in silence, or the children who bore his features. History, for nearly 2 centuries, would do the same, omitting her name, erasing her story, and preserving only his. Yet the truth lingered in whispers, family stories, and the faces of descendants who looked too much like the man who had written that all men were created equal. By the late 19th century, Monticello had become a ghost of its former self, a hollow shell of marble and memory standing over the Blue Ridge Hills. The grandeur that once defined Thomas Jefferson's estate had rotted into decay. Tourists came in small groups, guided by caretakers who repeated a script of glory and genius, never mentioning the people who had built the estate, nor the secret family that once lived in its shadows. Jefferson was still revered as a founding father, but the darker whispers about Monticello had never completely faded. Local papers occasionally revived old rumors, often dismissed as slander from political enemies, yet the story refused to die. It clung to the estate like the scent of smoke that never leaves a burned house. In the mid-1800s, before the Civil War tore the country apart, whispers of Jefferson's mixed-race descendants surfaced among freed black families in Virginia and Ohio. The Hemings name appeared in baptism records, property deeds, and letters, sometimes spelled differently, as if to hide or reclaim its meaning. One of Jefferson's sons by Sally, Madison Hemings, gave a rare interview to an Ohio newspaper in 1873. His words were calm, deliberate, without bitterness, but every sentence carried the quiet weight of a life born between two worlds. He confirmed what had long been suspected, that he and his siblings were the children of Thomas Jefferson. The public response was swift and divided. Jefferson's defenders called it fabrication, the delusion of an old man seeking attention. Others read it and fell into silence, sensing that the truth had finally stepped out from behind the veil. Madison's account included details only someone close to Jefferson could have known. The rooms, the routines, the quiet permission to leave Monticello in his later years. "My father was a man of the highest intellect," Madison said, "but he was also my master." The contradiction, once hidden in candlelit halls, now stood in print for the nation to see. As Reconstruction reshaped America, historians tried to preserve Jefferson's legacy as untarnished. Biographies omitted Sally Hemings entirely, or reduced her to rumor. Schoolbooks celebrated his authorship of the Declaration, his vision for the Republic, his genius in architecture. But beneath the official record, descendants of the Hemings family carried stories through generations, whispered at kitchen tables, passed down like sacred memory. Some lived as white, blending into a society that would never have accepted their truth. Others embraced their identity, knowing their blood carried both liberty and bondage in equal measure. By the 1950s, when civil rights began stirring the conscience of America, Jefferson's contradictions resurfaced with renewed force. Black scholars and journalists began to question the sanitized image of the Founding Fathers. The rumor of Sally Hemings was no longer dismissed as slander. It was re-examined as suppressed history. Letters from Monticello's archives revealed careful omissions, destroyed pages, and coded entries referring to certain members of the household. Each fragment hinted at a man terrified of exposure, yet unable to live by his own ideals of equality. Then came the science. In the 1990s, DNA testing offered what history had long resisted: proof. Genetic analysis of Jefferson and Hemings' descendants revealed a match, confirming that the lineage carried his Y chromosome. The finding ignited both outrage and vindication. For the Hemings family, it was not revelation but recognition. For historians who had built careers on Jefferson's untouchable virtue, it was an earthquake. Some still tried to deny it, suggesting that another Jefferson male might have fathered the children. But the simplest truth was the one that history had hidden all along. The author of America's freedom had enslaved and fathered his own bloodline. The revelation forced a national reckoning. At Monticello, curators began to restore Sally Hemings' room, a small windowless space near Jefferson's chambers, discovered beneath layers of plaster and paint. The air smelled of dust and age as archaeologists uncovered fragments of her world: broken ceramics, iron hooks, traces of a hearth. Each object felt like a whisper returned after 2 centuries of silence. Visitors began to walk through those rooms not as tourists, but as witnesses. The museum's narration changed from triumph to truth. Standing in those halls today, one can almost feel the weight of contradiction pressing against the walls. The ticking clock Jefferson designed still marks time on the entryway wall, its pendulum swinging like the breath of history itself. Outside, the same sun that once warmed Sally Hemings' children falls on the marble steps where Jefferson once stood, envisioning liberty for all men except those within his reach. The past no longer hides in shadows. It breathes through the voices of those once erased. The story of Monticello is no longer just about a president. It is about the fragile distance between ideals and actions, between public virtue and private sin. And as modern visitors leave the estate, many pause before the restored quarters of Sally Hemings, the silent room where the contradiction began. The floorboards creak softly beneath their feet, as if remembering every step, every whisper, every unspoken truth that history tried to bury but never could. The truth about Monticello's dark legacy did not fade with the passing of time. It deepened. When historians finally began to speak Sally Hemings' name aloud, it was as if a veil had been lifted from the nation's oldest myth. The image of Jefferson, the philosopher, the architect of liberty, fractured. What emerged was not the destruction of his legacy, but a more complete, unsettling portrait of a man who built a republic upon principles he could not live by. Visitors who once came to Monticello seeking inspiration now found themselves haunted by its silence. The house, with its perfect symmetry and elegant halls, felt colder once they knew who had walked them unseen. The Hemings descendants, scattered across the country, began to gather their stories. Some had lived generations believing their connection to Jefferson was family folklore, a strange rumor whispered by elders, never spoken in public. But with DNA proof came validation, and with validation came grief. They were not merely the descendants of an enslaved woman. They were the blood of a president who never claimed them. For them, the discovery wasn't triumph. It was mourning. For Sally, for her children, for the centuries of silence that had cost them their rightful place in history. At Monticello's visitor center, a quiet transformation began. Exhibits once devoted entirely to Jefferson's inventions and writings were replaced with displays of slave ledgers, family trees, and oral histories. The faces of Hemings' descendants appeared on screens beside his portraits. Their voices filled the space, recounting the pain and pride of lineage. One descendant said softly, "We don't come here for vengeance. We come here for truth." The words lingered in the air, both a reckoning and a reconciliation. Outside, on the hill where Jefferson's grave stands, the contrast is almost unbearable. His tombstone, carved by his own instruction, lists his proudest achievements: author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and father of religious freedom. Nowhere does it mention his presidency. Nowhere does it speak of Monticello, or the hundreds who lived and died enslaved under his watch. And nowhere, of course, does it name Sally Hemings, the woman whose silence preserved his myth. Tour guides often pause there, unsure how to explain the gap between words and deeds. The wind that sweeps over the ridge carries the sound of rustling leaves, like the faint echo of chains being remembered. Historians today struggle with how to teach Jefferson. Some say we must separate the man from his era, that he was a product of his time. Others argue that his contradictions define the American experiment. freedom proclaimed alongside oppression, equality spoken but denied. In the quiet of Monticello's halls, that debate feels painfully alive. Every invention, every book, every polished piece of furniture becomes a relic of duality, brilliance and blindness intertwined. The more one learns, the more one feels the unease of standing inside an unfinished confession. But what unsettles most is the realization that Jefferson's secret wasn't rare. Across the South, and indeed the nation, men who preached liberty fathered children they enslaved. Their bloodlines run through the veins of America, unacknowledged yet undeniable. Monticello, in that sense, is both symbol and mirror, the idealized face of the nation hiding its most intimate betrayal. Visitors leave with more questions than answers. How could a man who wrote "All men are created equal" look into the eyes of his own children and deny them freedom? Did he see his reflection in them, or did he force himself not to look? As dusk falls over the estate, the colors of the Virginia hills darken to blue and gold. The air grows still. It's easy to imagine Sally Hemings standing at one of the rear terraces, watching the same horizon her children would one day cross toward freedom. She would have known that their freedom meant disappearance, that to live free, they would have to erase their past, their names, their blood. In that knowledge lies the quiet tragedy of Monticello. Freedom purchased by silence, equality written in ink, but not in blood. Today, her story is finally spoken, not in accusation, but in remembrance. The truth has no bitterness left in it, only clarity. Jefferson's words remain carved in marble, but now they stand beside hers, unspoken yet eternal. In museums and classrooms, in the voices of descendants and the pages of history, the two stories finally meet, not to cancel each other, but to complete each other. For America cannot understand its freedom without acknowledging the shadow that birthed it. And as night settles over Monticello, that truth lingers in the air like the echo of a promise half-kept, half-broken, still waiting to be fulfilled. If you've made it this far, you've walked through the silence of Monticello, the place where freedom and hypocrisy lived under the same roof. You've heard the names they tried to erase, and felt the echo of truths that waited 2 centuries to be spoken. History doesn't whisper to those who look away. It speaks to those willing to listen. What happened here isn't just Jefferson's secret. It's America's. It's the wound beneath the words, the hidden cost of the liberty we still celebrate today. And as we uncover each fragment, as we speak the names long buried, we begin to see not just what they built, but what they broke, and what we must now restore. If stories like this move you, if you believe that truth, no matter how dark, deserves to be told, then join us. Subscribe to this channel and become part of a community that refuses to let history remain silent. Every week we bring you the forgotten, the forbidden, and the buried. The stories that changed the world in ways they never wanted us to know. Tell us what you think in the comments below. Should Jefferson's legacy be redefined or remembered as it was? How do you reconcile a man who wrote freedom while enslaving his own blood? Your voice matters here, because every comment, every share, every moment of reflection helps keep the truth alive and ensures that silence never wins again.